In this podcast, we're still talking about consideration, and here we discuss the duty owing to the promisor. We'll start with the rule. A promise to perform a pre-existing contractual duty is not good consideration. Now, this rule is where it all begins, and we have evolved quite a bit from here. So we'll start with the beginning and talk about why the rule is in place, and then we will move on to what we have now and discuss the policy behind that and whether the concern still remains. Now, this rule originated on a public policy ground, and the public policy was abuse of power and bad faith. And the rule can be traced back to 1791 in a case called Harrison Watson, where the captain of a ship that was in danger promised his crew that he would pay more in return for extra effort required in the circumstances. And when the captain later didn't pay and was taken to court, the court dismissed the claim, because on a matter of policy, agreements that are struck in circumstances where the crew might take advantage of the vulnerability of the captain ought not to be enforced. Now, this rule continued, but instead of a public policy ground, it later was enforced on the basis of lack of consideration. And you see that in Stilk and Myrick. It's the same concern. Two members of a ship's crew had deserted, and the captain did not recruit any replacements for them. Instead, the captain promised increased wages to the crew. And when the captain didn't pay it, the crew took him to court, and in court, the crew's claim failed for want of consideration. The court said that this crew had undertaken to do all they could in emergencies and were therefore bound by the terms of their original contract to exert themselves to bring about to bring the ship safely back to port. And their pre-existing duty required them to respond to the emergency created by the desertion of their crew members. So they didn't do anything extra to be paid extra. Now, look at where there's the promise to provide additional consideration that's extracted by a promisee who is exploiting the promisor's vulnerability. That agreement fails on the basis of the pre-existing duty rule, which is there is no additional consideration. So we don't do it necessarily on public policy ground, though the public policy ground is still there, but we do it for lack of consideration. There was one exception that was recognized back in 1915 in a case called Rago, where the parties had agreed to a mutual rescission of a prior agreement and the substitution of a new agreement. And there the new agreement was binding, even if it places increased burdens on just one of the parties. The court found that you don't have to expressly have mutual rescission, you can imply it. And the case there was that during World War I, the employer was going to close his business because he was suffering a loss of profit. However, when he called together all his employees to tell them, they all agreed instead to be paid less for as long as the war was ongoing, and when it was over, their salaries would go back to the current rate. Everybody continued happily, but one employee, after a few months after this new agreement, when the war was still on, sued the employer and demanded his usual salary back. The employee argued that there was no consideration for his promise to take less because he was still doing his job. And the court found that even though there had been no huge formal process of canceling the old employment agreement and making new one, it was still the case that the parties had gotten rid of the old agreements and entered into new ones. So they had mutually rescinded the agreements, and the new ones had been made. Now, the purpose of these rules is that courts want to prevent parties from threatening to breach one contract in order to get the other party to enter into another contract at a higher price. And otherwise you would be allowing a party to benefit from a threat of breaching. But this doctrine, which is the promise to perform a pre-existing duty is not binding for lack of consideration, this doctrine is also applicable when a voluntary agreement is entered into by two commercial parties with equal bargaining power. And you'll see that in Gilbert Steele. And that is a big problem. It's a big problem because when you take it to another realm, you have two parties equally sophisticated, they know what they're doing, and the concern about abuse and bad faith and exploitation, those concerns are not necessarily there, and yet you still have the rule. And it causes a lot of problems, which we will discuss in Gilbert Steele. In Gilbert Steele, the plaintiffs entered into a contract with the defendant to supply steel at a certain price, and steel prices generally increased throughout that time, and the plaintiff asked the defendant to increase the contract price. The defendant orally agreed to do it, but later refused to pay the increased price. The plaintiff sued, alleging that the new promise was enforceable. And the court had to deal with the same question. Can the pre-existing contractual obligation serve as consideration? And they decided it couldn't. Now, they said the plaintiff is required to provide fresh consideration for the defendant's fresh promise to pay the increased price of steel. Now, the plaintiff tried a whole bunch of arguments here. None of them worked. First, he tried to argue that consideration consisted of the rescission of their original contract and the replacement of the new one. And the court would not accept that. They wouldn't accept that there was a mutual abandonment of the old agreement through the later verbal contract. And they said if every time the parties modified any contract, we found rescission of the original one and a new one being made, then the rule that there is no consideration to do what a party was already bound to do, you could easily circumvent that rule. But the thing is, that argument is sound in theory because you do have that exception to this rule in Rago, where the exception being mutual rescission. So it's not that the court wouldn't accept the theory of it, it's that the court wouldn't accept this theory on the basis of the evidence. If it had been accepted, the parties would always be able to discharge their written obligation by arguing that they had a new verbal one, and you can imagine the problems with that. Another argument that the plaintiff had was that there was consideration for the promise by the buyer to pay the increased price. The promise to pay that price was supported by a promise by the supplier to give increased credit to the buyer, and the court rejected that as flawed. And finally, the plaintiff argued that the consideration was a commitment to give the defendant a good price on future steel if he went along with the increased price in the first contract. And the court rejected that one because it was merely a vague reference. Let's go to the problem with Gilbert Steele. This problem is that what the parties agreed to in Gilbert Steele was voluntary. The plaintiff understood the agreement to be binding. There was never a question of duress that was raised in the decision. And the reason this is a problem is because duress is the entire reason that this rule exists. If you go back to Stilkenmeyerk, we have this rule because we are worried that parties are going to exploit each other if we don't. So this doctrine has been criticized substantially for standing in the way of a more realistic and modern method of dealing with a contractual modification where the modification is legitimate. And in Gilbert Steele, the modification would absolutely have been legitimate, but you see here that the court was bound by this rule and could not give effect to the parties' agreement. The purpose of the rule is to prevent a stronger party from taking undue advantage of a weaker party. And we can see from the cases we talked about, there could absolutely be unfair pressure to modify a business arrangement. But there may be situations where the modification is legitimate, like where it turns out that the work is more expensive and costly than the party originally perceived, such as in Gilbert Steele. So the Gilbert Steele case caused a significant amount of problems, and courts had to figure out ways to get around it or to circumvent it. One of the ways, as we discussed, is mutual rescission, where if the court finds that the parties have mutually rescinded their old agreement and entered into a new one, then they will give effect to the new one. Another exception is to place a fresh promise under seal, and you'll remember that we very briefly talked about placing promises under seal. If you'll recall, placing one under seal is one of the exceptions to the rule that there must be consideration to create a binding contract. So a promise under seal is an exception to the consideration doctrine as a whole. And finally, the third one is we could modify the strict doctrine of consideration by focusing more on whether there is duress. And you will see that third exception has more and more emphasis placed on it as we go through the case law. In Williams and Roffey, the court revisited the rigid doctrine of Stilk and Myrick. Williams and Roffey involved the defendant general contractor retaining the plaintiff carpenter as a subcontractor on a project that involved the renovation of 27 flats. The plaintiff was having financial difficulties when performing the contract because the agreed price for the work was too low, and he was having problems with supervising his workforce. The defendant contractor was worried that the plaintiff may not complete in time, which would mean that the defendant contractor would be liable to the owners. So the defendant agreed to pay the plaintiff £10,300 more in addition to the contract price, and the defendant made one payment, but then when he failed to make further payments, the plaintiff stopped working and claimed damages. And the issue was, again, does the new agreement fail for want of consideration? The court said, look, there is a reason we have the rule in Stilk and Myrick. It is absolutely valid. But where there is other consideration to support the agreement to pay an extra sum, that agreement will be enforceable. Now, what the court here found to be other consideration was benefits. So where the benefits are derived by each party to the contract that you varied, even if one party didn't suffer a detriment, then that's okay. Basically, both parties will benefit from this agreement, and it's not necessary that each one suffers a detriment. So let's explain that. Here, if the subcontractor, after agreeing to perform the work at a fixed price, declines to continue unless the contract increases the price, that's duress. And any agreement that the contractor entered into to pay an increased price would be voidable. So here, if we are to look for duress, there is no indication of it, because the reason we have this rule is because we're concerned about duress. So the first thing we have to look at is there duress? So look here. Well, the initiative for the new agreement came from the defendant, not the plaintiff. So if it had been different, if the plaintiff had approached him and said, I'm not working until you pay me more, that's different. But here it was the defendant who approached the plaintiff. And although the plaintiff didn't undertake to do any work that he was not originally bound to do, the court said that the terms that he was to carry out the work were varied, and they said that variation was supported by consideration. And the court said both sides benefited by this agreement. So they both have a commercial advantage. What is the benefit? Well, they didn't need to hire additional subcontractors. Rather, the defendant didn't need to hire an additional subcontractor if the plaintiff couldn't do it. The defendant avoided the delay penalty in the contract. And then they put this last ground on, which was they replaced the payment structure as just another reason. So since the Williams and Roffey decision, the law has given effect to such modifications, provided the circumstances are fair and equitable, and they don't give rise to questions regarding unconscionability, fraud, or duress. Stilk and Myrick continue to apply to gratuitous promises. if you want to uphold a new agreement, you have to find that there is a benefit. Both parties are benefiting. There was an explicit adoption of Williams and Rofe, which is a British case, in Canadian law, in the next case, which is NAF Canada.